Welcome to Lynn's Warriors, where we confront the stories others avoid, and we always try to ask questions that matter most when it comes to protecting children, families, and the future. Today, we're diving into a story that should stop everyone in their tracks. The U.S. fertility rate has fallen again in 2025, hitting yet another record low. This is not just a statistic, this is a signal, a warning where our culture is headed and what it means for our next generation. So joining us is expert, and she's coming back to the Warriors, Emma Waters, Senior Policy Analyst in the Center for Technology and the Human Person at the Heritage Foundation, and also author of the new book, Lead Like Jael, 7 Timeless Principles for Today's Women of Faith, who has been sounding the alarm on what she calls a cultural shift with real world consequences. Emma argues that what's often celebrated as empowerment has come with a cost, pointing to decades of messaging. I'm going to agree with all of this that pushed career above family and redefine what success looks like for women. So we're going to ask some hard questions. When did children become optional instead of essential? What happens to a society that stops replacing itself? And most importantly, who's paying the price for these cultural changes? It's not about judgment, it's about truth, it's about data and the future of our children, our families. So let's just get into it. You can follow Emma. I'll have everything in the body of this video. She's on X at ML Waters, also heritage.org. Also, she's on Instagram. Welcome back, Emma Waters, to the Warriors.
Hi, Lynn. It's so good to be with you again.
Thank you. That was a mouthful. Let's jump in. Let's get into this fertility rate. Give us an update. You were here quite a while ago. We were just discussing that before we went on. But now things have shifted again. So give us the landscape.
Yeah, so you are exactly right that every single year since 2007, with a single year exception around COVID, birth rates have been on a steady decline. And as we've seen with this most recent announcement in 2025, birth rates fell to an average of 1.57 children per woman. Now, that is well below the replacement rate of 2.1 and really puts us on par, and not in a good way, with many of the European developed nations whose birth rate is also falling anywhere between 1.3 and 1.6. And so a couple of the interesting things that came out of this study, one, we've obviously seen a massive decline in teen pregnancies. So that's a good thing, right? Like there are fewer teens getting pregnant unexpectedly. So that's part of the decline, some have argued, though I think there's a lot more to debate there. But the thing that really stood out to me is that as of this data, 50% or nearly 50% of 30-year-old women today don't have children.
Wow.
So half of 30-year-old women today, nearly, don't have children. But in 1976, that percentage was only 18%. So the majority of women in 1976 would have had at least one child by age 30. Today, half do. And some of the other studies we've seen is that if women make it to age 30 without having their first child, there's only a 50% chance that they will go on to have children. So that's just based on predictive data of what has happened. So that could change as ages are maybe getting older. But I think one of the things that's really stood out to me is that in delaying having children, and in many cases that corresponds with delaying getting married, many women are taking a serious risk as to whether they'll ever have kids. And maybe it's because of circumstances outside of their control with infertility or not finding a partner that they want to have kids with. And maybe it's because of this cultural messaging that's really pushed women toward this career first mindset, where the first thing they should be concerned about is career. And if the chips fall into place elsewhere, that's good, but isn't really setting them up for success in this area.
I wanted to ask you, like what's behind this decline? I mean, I was 32 when I had my last baby, and the doctor told me I was old, but it was a long time ago. But like, wow. But what do you think? Do you really think it's all part and parcel of this ideology, culture? I'm telling you, because in my day, it really was, it's career, and you can have everything, and you can do it all. And I'm telling you, you can't. So what do you think has really played into a lot of this?
Yeah, so I would say that there is no single driver of declining birth rates. And so, because of that, there's no single solution. And so, you're looking at a host of factors. Technologically speaking, you're looking at the introduction of things like abortion, birth control, and IVF, which we can talk about the moral status of all of those things. But we do know that those technologies, those reproductive technologies, have had a significant impact on childbearing patterns, especially for women. So, you have the technological angle, and then also technology like social media and dating apps and pornography. That's also had a really big impact on marriage and baby rates. I would say, second to that, you do have a decline in marriage. And if you are less likely to get married, you're less likely to have kids, because within marriage, birth rates are not quite as high as they once were, but they're largely still at replacement level. It's just that now more than ever, we have fewer men and women getting married, or they're waiting much later to get married. And then it's much harder to have kids at that point, as you pointed out. I think you have cultural factors and the cultural factors are everything from girl boss feminism to true corners of masculinity that are like very unhealthy, to the general battle of the sexes that has really characterized so much of our modern age. And then I think you also have policy issues where you have marriage penalties in our welfare system that literally deter people from getting married. You have tax policies or inflation or economic stressors that make it harder to afford getting married and having kids. And that plays into the economic question as well of, I think it was in the 1960s, the majority of 30-year-olds had gotten married, had a kid, and owned a home, like in the 70 percentile. And today, only 12% of 30-year-olds have done all three of those things by the time they're in their 30s. And a lot of it has been the fact that while wages have largely remained stagnant when accounting for inflation, the cost of a house has gone up 7 times accounting for inflation. So like it is 7 times more expensive to buy a house than your income allows for. And these are just like very practical economic questions of,
Yeah.
okay, you want to get married and have kids, but you're like genuinely asking, can I afford to do this? And the last thing I'll say on this is there was a New York Times article that came out a couple of months ago, or weeks ago, sorry, looking at declining birth rates among women who were 20 to 24 years old without a bachelor's degree. They argued that birth rates have actually declined 50% for women in that category, non-college educated, 20 to 24 years old. And what was so interesting in the article is that the majority of women weren't saying, oh, I want to pursue my career, like I don't want kids. They were women who genuinely were saying, like, I want to be a stay-at-home mom. I want to be
Yeah.
present with my kids. I don't want to work a wage shift where my kids are in daycare 12 hours a day. And they were like, I don't physically, financially know how we're going to make that happen. And so for them, it really was this economic question of how do I afford to have the kind of family that I want. So it's not an easy answer to your question, but I do think it's technological, it's cultural, it's policy, it's economic, it's all of these forces that have really just been trending toward an anti-family, anti-life agenda for decades now.
Wow. Emma, you're like an encyclopedia. I could talk to you for hours on end about all of this. We have to get the information out to our warriors, listening, that they have to know about these things and think about them and read up on them and follow you, obviously. And what about these popular figures we have, in our society today, cultural, we have these influencers. I don't even like that word, but okay, influencers, people like women like Sheryl Sandberg, for instance, with her lean in and all, they used to be going around the country. I don't even know if they still do it, giving these speeches and telling women all these different things. And there are others as well. How do you think that has really played into anything? Because now I'm listening to you. I always blame money for a lot of things, because I hear that a lot, like we can't afford a baby, or how are we're going to work to pay a stranger to take care of our baby. So give us a little bit about that. Do you think these people, I don't want to use the word popular, but the ones we see online or we have seen, how do they play into our young women and women as a whole, and even girls?
Yes. Oh, this is a huge piece of the puzzle, I think. And it's worth breaking down here that when we're talking about these questions, keeping in mind class and socioeconomic status is
Hmm.
huge, because there are different demands and trade offs that you're making depending on what situation you find yourself in. If you are part of Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In movement, you are working a white collar job.
Yes.
Post COVID, it's a laptop job, far more flexible and remote than ever before. There are opportunities that come with that are simply not available if you're working a job in a wage economy, at a fast food restaurant, in hospitality, at a hotel. If you're working as a receptionist somewhere, like those are jobs that require you to be in person to do your job. And they're not exactly jobs that are very flexible with kids. You can't have, your baby napping and crying on your shoulder while while you're answering calls for a business. And there are different kinds of jobs that certain women are going to be more or less likely to work. That has to be like, so just front and center, like there are different dynamics here at play. I think with the Sheryl Sandbergs of the world, the thing that is so concerning to me is that her lean in movement really took off in the 2010, 2012 era, which is where you see girl boss feminism start to really take
Mhm.
up. And it's this idea that, and this is like a very distinct thing, even apart from different iterations of feminism we can discuss, where you see this push that says, like, to be a fulfilled and self actualized woman, your career, your promotions, and your success and ambition as a career woman is the thing that really defines you. Sure, you can have a family, sure, you can have kids, but your first priority should be to work and to be a successful woman. And so this is where you get the 2012 Atlantic article, Why Women Still Can't Have It All, which was by Anna Marie Slater, and was her wrestling with the demands of being a top executive in the Obama administration, and the fact that her teenage son wouldn't speak to her because she wasn't present, and he was really struggling with that. And you see this tension, and it's sort of like, well, work is the assumed good for women, and then you figure out the others. And I think that's where we've gotten it completely backwards, where it should be, no, family is the assumed good, and what is your children need should be the primary question. And if you can work outside of that, that's fine, but that's not what girl boss feminism has been preaching to women. And what's so interesting is a couple of weeks ago in People magazine, Sheryl Sandberg actually did an interview with them where she was talking about the quote detrimental effect of the trad wife movement. And she was really saying, like, women should have choice, women can do whatever they want. But also, these trad wives telling women just to be traditional homemakers and wives and mothers, well, that's really detrimental. It's actually bad for women. And you're like, well, is it about choice, Sheryl? Or are you actually unhappy with the choice these women are making? Because it's not the choice you want them to make, which is to be career minded and career first. And then, like a week after this interview came out, the Wall Street Journal broke that that Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In organization was
Mhm.
downsizing by
Yeah.
25%, which is a massive flag to me that, oh, women aren't buying into your model of girl boss feminism. In fact, a lot of them probably feel really betrayed by it. You're downsizing, and now you're blaming everything that you can to try to ignore the fact that, like, maybe women actually just don't like your model of career first work ethic that you've been promoting.
And that it doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't
It's
work.
kind of, to put it very simply, it doesn't work being sold as bill of goods. Um, Emma, share with us, when we take kids, babies, children, and instead of, we make them what I would call maybe a capstone instead of a cornerstone
Mhm.
in family, in society. Um, what does this do to the future of America, the future of family and communities?
It means that you are far more likely to delay getting married, and you're far more likely to delay having kids if you think that the first priority is establishing yourself in your career, getting your higher education. In many cases, you see men and women buying their first homes and really seeking financial stability and independence. And so there's this, I think, shift in how we think about marriage, where it used to be that you would get married, maybe younger, maybe not, but oftentimes younger than what we're
Mhm.
seeing today, and you would start out young and broke and figuring it out together. And this is kind of what my husband and I did, getting married right out of college, where you're like, we don't really have much of a savings account and we don't own a home, but we're going to figure this out together, and
Yeah.
we're going to forge this life and start having kids, even if we might not be making nearly as much as a lot of other people are making, but we're willing to sacrifice and figure it out, right? But if you have this sort of capstone mindset where you're like, no, I need to get all of my ducks in a row before I can get married, before I can have kids, because that's the quote responsible thing to do, then you find yourself in a position where I think that's like a false sense of security. Like, does anyone ever feel like they're actually established, or they've actually made it, or they're ready to get married, or they're ready to have
Right.
kids? I think like that idea that you're going to reach this magical stage where you're like, now I am ready to have children, is in many ways just so misleading. There's a lot you can and should do to prepare. But this idea that like you'll magically reach this place where it just makes sense, I think it's very false. And the story that I think best encapsulates this is one of my former colleagues a few years ago. She, in her own words, she was like, I girl bossed really hard. She is brilliant. She had all of the coolest positions, didn't get married till she was 38, didn't have her first baby till she was 39. And she came to me one day and she was like, Emma, I'm in a position now where I am being offered the biggest job opportunities and biggest promotions of my career, the ones I've been working my
Mm.
entire professional life to achieve. And statistically speaking, you get your biggest opportunities in your 40s and 50s, especially for women. And she was like, and yet I have a 6 week old baby. And so all of a sudden, because I delayed having kids, I'm now looking at my 6 week old baby who I want nothing more than to stay home with and not leave her with a nanny 10 to 12 hours a day, or turn down the biggest career opportunity and say goodbye to this career that I have slaved away for years. And she was like, it is a lose lose situation. And she just looked at me with tears in her eyes and she was like, Emma, whatever you do, don't put yourself in this position where you're starting to have kids right as your career, if you're still working, is
Right.
going to take off, because you're pitting all of these essential goods against each other. And this is where a lot of what I've been talking about recently, and what I talk about a lot in Lead Like Jael, is this idea of being strategic and taking a seasonal approach to life, which is to say, what does it look like to actually prioritize babies and marriage and brainstorming in your 20s and early 30s, and recognize that statistically speaking, your biggest career opportunities can and will still come. They're just not going to come till later. So why delay kids for that same season when you could maybe order it and order your life in a way that actually better aligns with all of those different interests and callings that women may feel like they have?
I think, Emma, what you just said is the most important thing. It was always build the career, build the career. And then as the women, at least in my book, the women I know, a lot of them, as they approached 40, oh, I better now have a baby. Kind of as opposed to have the baby, have the children, then work towards that if you choose to do that. Very interesting. Tell us a little bit about the book. I frankly have not read it yet, I admit, but I did order it. So,
Awesome. Love.
but finish us up about the book. I think it's a very important read. I want to recommend it to everybody. Tell us what inspired you to do this
Yes.
and what we'll take away from it.
Yes. So Lead Like Jael, 7 timeless principles for
Yeah.
today's women of faith, begins the conversation in this girl boss feminism versus trad wife dichotomy, really trying to understand what are the cultural debates and difficulties women are facing today. Now, my book, contrary to maybe what some would assume from a conservative like myself, doesn't actually say either of them are the right answer. I think girl boss feminism has been very detrimental, culturally speaking, to women,
Yeah.
but I don't think the trad wife movement is the solution. In fact, it's actually a signal that women are unhappy with the options they've been given, and they're looking for a better story, and a better framework. And so Lead Like Jael says that we should take a seasonal approach to life that puts first things first. And speaking to women, and particularly women who have children, those first things first start with your marriage and with your kids. And anything else that the Lord calls you to do, especially when you have small kids at home, needs to complement and come after those primary callings and not compete with them. So I start Lead Like Jael actually with my own story, where I really wrestled with this in my own life when I was in college, to the point where I actually broke up with my boyfriend because I was so terrified that children would ruin my life that I thought I would rather just not get married, even though I was madly in love with this amazing man that thankfully we did end up getting married and having now
Yay.
our third on the way. But I was so terrified and felt like it was such a lose lose proposition that it would be better just to focus on career. And the reality is the more I've shared this story, the more I hear this from so many young women, Gen Z, young millennial, even Gen Alpha, where they come up to me after I speak at events, and maybe half the questions people have for me are about my policy areas. But half the questions I'm being asked are like, well, how do you get married? How do you date? How do you
Yes.
attract a man? How are you a mother? What does that even like? How do you make sense of becoming a mother when you're working? And like, how do I think about these things? And like, those are the very practical questions I think so many women are wrestling with, that I wanted to take the time and craft that together with my own story. And most importantly, with the Bible as the basis, because so much of what we see today is we'll argue about feminism versus anti-feminism, girl boss versus trad wife, or this versus egalitarian versus complementarian, this versus that. And none of those actually provide women with the tools they need to discern what their particular situation is going to look like. And I don't think it looks like one thing for every family. And so I go through 7 principles of discernment, shrewdness, resourcefulness, hospitality, marriage, motherhood, and women as wise counselors, as 7 of the areas I think women really need to be equipped and empowered to think through the lens of the Bible to address the biggest issues of our day. And so that's what we do in the book. It was a very fun thing to write, but it was also incredibly vulnerable because it was me dealing with what were
Yeah.
some of my biggest fears in life and seeing the way that the Lord and like the abundance and generosity of the Lord and the goodness of his word just came in and totally revolutionized how I thought about these things.
Emma Waters, you are a warrior. I have to say, God bless you and congratulations on your children, your family, upcoming little baby. I have to say, as a mom and a grandma, like, thank you for your insight and your courage and speaking out for all of this. And I think you hit the nail on the head because I'm finding a lot of young women, even teens, like like Lynn, what was it like to date like in the 70s? And I'm like, really? Because they're used to internet and online and all that. How did you meet people? These very simple questions, which I don't even want to laugh at that. I think the pendulum, Emma, is swinging back. And I think we have the power for the new generation. I know sometimes these aren't easy conversations, but they're necessary. And to our community, we thank you so much. I want to have you back. I want to go through the book a little more
Yeah.
and talk about some of the stories. So we'll structure that because the future is not something that just happens. It's something, Emma, we have to protect, we have to fight for, and we have to build. And I want us and I want you to be the leader in all of this. So thank you, Emma. I will have all of your information in the body of this video. Everybody needs to buy this book. I'll have the links there, and we will definitely talk again soon. There's a lot to talk about. Thank you, Emma.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Thanks.